In the sleepy town of Windarm, a street where no one goes, a child of wondrous prying was deadened in crooked pose. His name was Samuel Craven, a boy no older than 10, sneaking out from the safety of his home, a reluctant one then. The breeze of the night engulfed him as he ran free and clear to his doom, to a place which never existed, but he found it no less in his room. At night the shadows would scurry and paint pictures of streets on his wall, as he'd lie in his bed and observe a place where children stood tall. Each night the picture grew stronger as slivers of dark made the scene, a street of cobble and houses, glowing windows, thatched roofs, and oak beams. On his wall, shadowed children would scamper, playing late and loud as they pleased, while Samuel lay there in envy of the place he so wanted to be, for his parents seemed strict and distant, far removed from the freedom he yearned. And of course Samuel wished for an instance where the rules of grown-ups could be spurned. Night upon night he was beckoned by the children playing tag on the wall, and the rules of his parents rang harshly in his ears, in his soul, in him all. On the 5th night the picture froze sharply, and the shadows of children turned round to face Samuel Craven with wide grins in place, made of dark and of light, which was drowned. "Come with us, dear Samuel," they whispered. "You can play with us in our street, and you never need worry about grown-ups again, for here parents and children shan't meet." Young Samuel did not have to answer, for he leapt from his bed with glee, through the wall where empty eyes watched him, open-handed, and whispered, "Be free," as the thin shadowed hands of the children grabbed his own and pulled him within. The world turned gray to poor Samuel, and his vision began to dim. "Welcome home, my dear little boy," said a voice cracked with age, wheezed and thin. And as his sight was enroached by the darkness, Samuel saw what had spoken to him. A figure stood at the end of the street, something tall and spindly of limb, wearing rags of gray, dirtied fabric, and of absence of life there within. Its eyes were putrid and glassy, and its mouth gaped with rotten lament against those with joy in childhood, and of people and of time misspent. "Come closer, dear Samuel, and do not be afraid, for I am seeking little, nothing more, than to keep you away from the grown-ups of that world you have found such a bore. Look at the children who stay here," said the figure with bony hands raised, and as Samuel shuddered with a chill in the air, he knew the grave choice that he had made. For the children played not, so to speak, but were frozen in crooked positions, like scarecrows warding off the unwanted, the figures' prized acquisitions. Mouths stitched tightly in place, eyes pleading and ears strained to listen, as the shrouded vagabond figure walked amongst the deadlocked children. "They too once wished to run far away from those who were old and stern, and of course I granted that wish by making shadowed statues of them." The vagabond moved ever closer, and Samuel saw its round opaque eyes. There was nothing of love about them, only pain and a well of demise, as its rotten, coughed upon garments ruffled quickly in the bleak night air. Samuel turned to face his bedroom, running fast to the safety he held there, but his movements were quickly restricted by the cracks in the creaks all around, of the hands of the petrified children, shadowed fragments of life now death-bound. Scared little Samuel struggled and cried out loud as he could, but quickly his screams were muffled by fingers like rigid warped wood. "And now it's time," said the vagabond, showing his teeth, white and bled. While slithering hands gripped the boy in place, the figure held needle and thread. Darting in front of small Samuel, the needle glistened with delight, and the children forced a smile on his face, with their hands withered in sight. As their fingers pulled at the corners of his mouth and prodded inside, Samuel cried in desperate terror, tasting charcoal and rancid skinned hide. The vagabond now simply reveled as he pierced helpless Samuel's top lip, pulling needle through his skin and followed by thread, before laughing and gargling on spit. Coldness now took young Samuel, as his skin began to fade. Like the other children around him, life and hope were reneged. "I will seal up your lips and take your light," said the vagabond, holding the needle, "and add you to my gaggle of souls, filled with hate for those who are feeble." And as the needle hovered and danced, tears streamed down Samuel's face, to be back to his cozy bedroom, find his steps in simple retrace. That was all he could think of, but now nothing more could be done. For as his skin turned to shadow, and his eyes began to burn, the vagabond stared intently, spit drooling from open, gaped lips, and with one last thrust the needle drove straight to extinguish the child's heart by eclipse. Howls of pain and anguish cut through the cold, darkened street. But it was not young Samuel who yelled in pain. It was the vagabond who had to retreat, for standing shoulder to shoulder, dragged the figure with all of their might, were Samuel's parents emboldened by their son's cries for help in the night. They pulled at the creature's limbs, knocking needle from sworded hand, as the shadowed children creaked forward, following their master's commands. "Take their light, now, my children," said the vagabond, seething with hate. "These grown-ups must be punished. Stitch their lips and seal their fate." And Samuel lay on the cobble, crying and desperate for home, as the vagabond threw both his parents to the ground next to their son. They cradled the boy's head softly and whispered, "Don't be afraid," as the shadowed children surrounded, open-eyed with fingers like blades. But looking at young helpless Samuel, something stirred in each shadowed face, of memories of home and of love, and of forgotten and once lived-in place. The memory of family came flooding, like a tide of bitter regret, of sleeping in darkness for centuries and being snatched from warm, comfy beds. Slowly the children cracked onward as the vagabond closed in tight, yet not to assist their captor, but to stop him with all of their might. A sea of shadowed child fingers pulled and clawed at the rags of the vagabond, once their master, who'd sewn each of their stitching and gags. Samuel's parents did not need to ask for one more second of time, and grabbed their son as quickly as they could, fleeing the scene of the crime. As the figure tore down his children, each one of their stitchings pulled out. He rasped and he screeched with venom at the family who'd caused such a rout. His horde of children lay on the floor, wide-eyed and mouths ripped open, as he flung himself towards the three who'd left his street empty and broken. Panting and rushing and heaving, Samuel's parents flew to the edge of what the street now ended, and bedroom made safety its pledge. The vagabond soon quickly followed as the family leapt within, to their house and the room that they had chosen for their son to play and sleep in. As the figure ever drew closer, a seething wretch of the night, Samuel's mother leapt to the corner and simply turned on the light. No shadows were there to be feared of, no vagabond, children, or street. Nothing which spoke of the danger which their boy had taken to meet. The years moved on with Samuel, though he would never forget his mistake, running from those who loved him, to strangers who'd promises make. And now young Samuel is grown up, his daughter asleep in her room. As shadows and whispers spill over, from the street, the vagabond's tomb. I've told this story many times, and without exception, it has provoked the same reaction. Disbelief. No matter how difficult it is for people to process, and no matter how many conventional explanations have been offered, this did happen, and it's an experience that I will never forget. It started with a friend of mine, Stuart, who'd always been interested in the supernatural. I, on the other hand, had no more interest in it than the next person. Of course, I'm curious about whether there is life after death, and for selfish reasons, but I prefer to leave these things to themselves, as I find the entire subject morbid. I'm sure I'll learn the truth in the end. But until that day, I'd rather not ask the question for fear of the answer. Either way. Stuart was captivated by the paranormal. He lived and breathed it. But our friendship had developed through another of his passions, film. And although he often asked me to go to one of his investigations, I always replied that I preferred such things to remain on the cinema screen, and to stay there. We'd go for a few beers regularly at Farland's bar on the main street, or catch a film at the local cinema with some mutual friends. And then, suddenly, I didn't see or hear from him for a couple of weeks, which was peculiar, but I assumed that he was simply busy, and so I left it at that. It was 3:04 a.m. when he called. I was angry at first that he'd woken me up, but when I heard the sound of his voice, anger quickly bled into concern. Stuart was always such an upbeat guy, but that night his voice sounded distant, and there was new uncertainty I had never sensed before which quivered underneath each word, unsettling me. "I need you to come and get me," he said in a low whisper. "What's wrong? Where are you?" I asked. "I can't talk for long. Just come to the old botanical gardens at the end of town." His breath became increasingly labored and agitated as he spoke. "Stuart, if you're in trouble, call the police." "No!" he exclaimed in a unique mix of whisper and shout. "I'm not meant to be here. They'll arrest me. Just come to the botanical garden and send me a text when you're waiting outside. I have to go." And with that, he hung up. 10 minutes later, I was in my car and driving to the edge of Windarm Town. It was an autumn night, and as I passed landmarks which usually familiar to me during the day, each twisted tree branch and leaf garden took on a more threatening nature than I was used to, the night revealing an unapparent side to the town that I loved. It seemed strange to me that Stuart would be in the botanical gardens at night. He quite regularly went away on nocturnal investigations of abandoned hospitals and other supposedly haunted locations, but that place didn't seem like an obvious choice for such things. In the past, the gardens housed beautiful exotic trees, plants, and wildlife under a massive greenhouse which must have been over 200 feet in length, but it had been shut down for a few decades. I guess the townsfolk didn't frequent it often enough to keep it afloat. Even when I was a kid, that place was just fodder for a rock or two, shattering many of its countless panes of glass, each held in place by a rusted frame. Although, admittedly, my throw fell short more often than not. I know my dad talked about going there when I was a kid, amazed by the place. A self-contained tropical landscape even during Winarm's bleakest winters. I pulled up in front of a large metal fence. It had been erected years previous, encircling what was left of the botanical garden and its grounds, no doubt to dissuade new generations of rock throwers. On its gate hung a mud-smeared sign displaying the words, "No trespassing," in no uncertain terms. Stuart obviously hadn't bothered with the warning, no doubt more interested on catching a glimpse of something otherworldly inside. I left the engine running, as it was a little cold out. But just as I unlocked my phone, I received a new text message. "Kill your lights." And so I did. And then another message quickly followed. "Don't call me, whatever you do." I began to develop the distinct impression that Stuart and I were not the only ones present out there in the night. A nervousness crept into my breath, and as I sat there looking into the darkness of the gardens, particularly obscured by a web of fencing, I felt as though something was staring back. And for a moment I was unsure how to proceed, but then was startled by another text message and frightened by the thought that Stuart was in there somewhere and about to be grabbed by a burly security guard, a local gang, or worse. I adhered to his instructions. "Follow my light and get me the hell out of here." And there it was, Stuart's torch flickering for a brief moment before being engulfed by the darkness once more. I opened the car door, the night uncomfortably cold as it washed over me. Just 30 minutes earlier, I had been cozy, sleeping in my bed, and now this, climbing over a fence and walking into God knows what. The fence rattled as I pulled myself up, and as I reached the top, I looked over the pitch night and seriously reconsidered going any further. But then, Stuart's torchlight flashed again, and I knew I couldn't leave him, possibly injured or trapped, with the chilled October air threatening worse. I jumped down from the fence as quietly as I could, my feet muffled by the whispering grass below. The ground was wet, and the unattended grass and brushes which surrounded the main building made progress difficult. And the light flashed again, 3 times in fact, before Stuart turned it off once more. I was sure now that he was growing more agitated, and so I continued in the direction of the once glass building to reach my friend as quickly as possible. But my footsteps were uncertain, and my eyes struggled to pierce the dark. I took my phone and I used the LED light on its back to see where I was going. As I walked towards the large shadowed outline of the garden building, I grew increasingly apprehensive. There were only 3 possible reasons why Stuart turned on his torch intermittently. One was that it had broken somehow. Perhaps he could only get it to flicker to life every few minutes. Another explanation would be that the battery was low. Perhaps he was lost and switched it off to conserve what little juice it had left. But the last explanation was a less appealing one. I switched off my light at the thought of it. Perhaps he didn't want to draw too much attention to his location. Maybe he was frightened that someone else would find him first. The darkness stood before me, a wall of black which blanketed it all. It was hopeless. I was going to have to switch the light on to see where I was going. I remembered when I was 14 and I had nearly fallen down an old drainage shaft when I was camping at night with friends. I always shuddered thinking about that, about how bad that fall could have been. I needed to see where I was going. If a security guard came in and found me, then that was a better outcome than falling into the darkness somewhere unseen. And yet, the thought of a night guard seemed far-fetched. The old building had been derelict for years, and it seemed unlikely that the town would waste money on wages for someone to patrol the area at night. Finally, I reached the building, its base made of red brick which had held up surprisingly well for its years of neglect. The same could not be said of the frame, large metal struts reaching up to the sky, forming a huge domed roof. I could see pictures of the frame lying on the floor, and in the dim light with my phone, I thought I saw strands of it hanging from the roof, just waiting to break off and impale any unwelcome trespassers. I cringed at the thought of my friend lying somewhere inside, perhaps impaled or trapped by falling metal or masonry. Stuart's light flickered again, and then disappeared. It was indeed coming from inside, and as I ducked under and then through one of the countless empty metal frames, I realized that he was somewhere in the middle of the building. Despite having no walls, there was an echo of sorts to the place. Subtle, my footsteps ricocheted gently off the concrete floor and then flittered out into the bleakness of the night. That was when I first noticed it. The cold. Sure, it was always cold in October, but as I slowly proceeded, shards of broken glass crackling occasionally under my weight, a chill in the air grew more pronounced. It bit at my exposed face, and I was convinced that if I looked in the mirror, my nose would have been bright red. There. Stuart's light. It was closer now, and for the first time I saw the light reflecting upwards for a moment and illuminating Stuart's outline. As I drew nearer, the night closed in, and the cold was now becoming almost unbearable. My hands ached from the bones outward, and the air froze my insides with each breath. I was now only a few meters away from the center of that old glassless dome and my friend. And then light flickered again, but it seemed obscured somehow, as if Stuart had turned his back on me, the light from his torch bathing him in illumination for only the briefest of seconds.
"Stuart, it's Mike. Are you okay?"
I said softly.
"Yes, let's get the hell out of here,"
he replied nervously. And then a new noise joined us. Just as I opened my mouth to whisper across to Stuart and ask him if he was hurt, the sound of broken glass breaking under weight echoed from behind. It came from somewhere behind us and was subtle at first, but there was no doubt. I could hear movement. Yes, footsteps, more pronounced. They were moving towards us, and then they stopped. All I could hear was my heart thumping, the adrenaline of apprehension coursing through my veins, and quickly I switched off the light from my phone, hoping to obscure our location.
"Someone else is in here,"
I said.
"I know. They've been wandering around me for hours."
And then the footsteps moved again, this time circling, prowling under cover of night. I knew then why Stuart had called me. Someone was taunting him. They'd been in that broken glass dome all along, terrifying my friend and me in the process. No doubt he had been terrified. But now that there were two of us, and whoever was circling, they were surely but one. I decided that we would act, pick a direction, and stick to it. I moved close to my friend and I whispered,
"Follow me." "Sure."
That word still haunts me. The light from Stuart's torch came on once more, but you see, it wasn't a torch. And whoever I was standing right in front of was not my friend Stuart. A strange light emanated from inside the throat of what I can only describe as the figure of a woman. The light bled out through translucent skin which seemed to take on the appearance of night, and the light forced its way up and out of her gaping mouth. And at that moment, Stuart appeared from the darkness, grabbing my arm, and before I knew it, we were running, our feet scrambling over broken glass, pummeling it further into smaller shards. I looked over my shoulder at the horrid figure, light source and all, was chasing us. The light from her throat and mouth seemed to pulse with intermittent fury, and as we reached the metal frame of the building, she screamed words of hate and anguish, a rasping anger filled with nothing but contempt for the living. And before I knew it, we had escaped the gardens. That screeching creature seemingly constrained to the boundaries of that derelict building. We reached the fence, then the car, and then at home, where I fixed both Stuart and myself a large whiskey as we tried to calm our nerves. As it turns out, Stuart had been on one of his investigations, as I'd thought. He'd heard stories of strange lights coming from the old Botanical Garden building at night, and he thought that he would check it out. He got more than he bargained for, that's for sure. At first, the old building seemed empty, but as the night drew in, he felt as though he was being watched. And suddenly, the batteries from his torch drained. The spare batteries he had always carried with him were equally unresponsive, and so he was left in the darkness, alone. It was then that he heard the footsteps, and a woman's voice who simply kept saying,
"I know you're here. I know you're watching me."
To Stuart, it sounded like she was pacing up and down, occasionally standing over him as he hid on the floor. God knows what would have happened if she found him. I'm sure that you realized by now that Stuart claimed he never called me on his phone or sent any text messages. Indeed, he dropped it in the darkness and still hasn't found it to this day. We talk about that night occasionally, and Stuart hasn't been on an investigation since. He lost the stomach for it. And who can blame him? My unease with the memory of that night, however, doesn't revolve around the fear of meeting some spectral creature in the night. I intended to stay as far away from that haunted place as I can. It's more of a fear which grabs me occasionally when I really think about what that night meant. If that horrid apparition is in any way what happens to us when we die, that we are filled with such hatred for the living, I'd prefer to believe that there is no life after death. For what we encountered that night was a twisted reflection of all that is good in each of us. And if no good can remain, I would rather not exist at all.